feeling like I need to be liked by everyone all the time, feeling like nobody likes me, feeling like I'm always alone. Hello everyone, my name is Nick Whitaker. I am a pastor in Santa Barbara, California, and today we're going to be talking about self-hatred. And so I want to introduce it with a concept. I'm curious what comes to mind when you hear the phrase social scoreboard. Maybe you haven't put it in those terms or heard it in that way before, but I'm sure we all have some idea of what I mean by that term, social scoreboard. Essentially, if you look at all of the regrets, the relationships, the ways you worked with people in the past, the successes you've had, the number of people you've dated, you have some idea of a standing or a ranking in your head of how well or poorly you're doing. And we focus on this social scoreboard most often when we're thinking about dating, who we can date, why we're getting rejected, what's going on in life. And sometimes when we focus on it too much, we fall into the trappings of self-hatred because we've introduced categories of what matters to us and why we matter to other people by saying, am I loved? Am I attractive? Do people want to date me? Now, the reason that this falls so much into self-hatred is because when we try to follow this social scoreboard, what we're doing is we're essentially trying to push that ranking up for ourselves. We're trying to think about, how can I climb this ladder? How can I be more attractive, more likable? Because ultimately what we're saying is what matters and what makes me matter is what other people think. And inevitably, there's going to be failure. There's going to be conflict. And when that happens, so often we feel like we don't matter anymore. And we begin to hate ourselves, saying things like, well, other people don't like me, so why should I? Well, today I want to introduce two biblical concepts that are going to help us to understand how we can stop focusing on the social scoreboard and start to understand what really matters, as in we're going to be reorienting our categories. To do this, we're going to be looking at some of the biblical wisdom literature from Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. So the first thing of these two that I want to suggest, a practical solution, is to take the third person. Now, I've heard many talks about Christian identity and where to find it and what is our identity and how do we define it, but it's rare that I've actually heard solutions introduced, and so I want to provide one. Now, when we start to think about life, we start to understand how we're going to treat other people, how we're going to care about ourselves. And I found some surprising statistics. For instance, there was a NutriSense study that went and looked at how people take care of their pets. What they found was kind of surprising to me. They found that people under 35 every single year make more visits to the veterinarian's office than they do the doctor's office. Now, this is just one study, but it illustrates the concept that young people tend to take better care of their pets than they do of themselves. And I'm sure we all love our pets, but do we not love ourselves? Now, I don't want to take this study out of context, so maybe I'll introduce a saying that you might have heard and I hear all the time. People will say to me, I find that I'm taking care of others, but in the end, I just feel sort of exhausted and drained myself. Another instance in which we can look at other people and care for them, but we don't tend to do so well for ourselves. This is because when we're looking at people in the same way we can identify their strengths and weaknesses more easily than our own, we also tend to care better for them than we can care for ourselves. Now, note, I'm not saying we care for them more. We still have the potential to be selfish, but we're able to care for them better because we're able to identify in other people what the needs are and see past wants. So for instance, somebody struggling with addiction might have a very difficult time identifying what their needs are. In fact, they might not even want to change. But it's the whole reason we have rehabilitation and interventions, because other people can begin to see their needs better than they can see their own. And the same principle applies when we're thinking about this social scoreboard. You see, when we're focused on a social scoreboard, what happens is we tend to narrow our vision down to the things that we want and what we think is going to help us, and we've lost the plot of what's really going on in life. But when other people begin to look at us, and more importantly, when God looks at us, they can identify those things as false categories. In fact, they can see it doesn't matter so much what other people think. It doesn't matter so much how many people like us, how attractive we're supposed to be. See, God, especially God, introduces real categories, the categories that matter, as in, am I loving the Lord with all my heart, soul, and strength? Am I loving my neighbor as myself? Am I living after the Lord Jesus Christ? And perhaps most importantly to our identity, am I listening to what God says about me, that I am treasured and loved enough that he would send his son to die for me? And so how do we escape this sort of self-narrative we're trapped inside of? Well, we take the third person. Here's what I mean. If you open up to Psalm 42, which is one of my favorite Psalms, you'll read about David exploring one of the most difficult and treacherous times of his life. Now, it's unclear exactly which time this is, but here's how the first 6 verses of this psalm goes. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude-keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. David does something pretty strange here, which is that he talks to himself. You see that in verse 5, he says, why are you cast down, O my soul? See, from his perspective, it's reasonable to lament and mourn because things are terrible, and he does that. But in the midst of that lamenting, he interrupts his own thoughts by talking to himself, and it's for the very reason that I was talking about. See, David begins to preach to himself amidst this psalm, asking his own soul questions. What he's doing in this is he's lowering his own perspective and yielding to one that's different. You see, if David's able to see his needs more than he can imagine by getting outside of himself, then how much more is God able to see David's needs? See, what David does is he's humbling himself. He's lowering the importance of how he analyzes the situation, and he's yielding to a godly perspective. He's preaching the gospel to himself, that there is hope amidst suffering. And that's what we do when we take the third person, is we stop living inside of our own categories for how we see life. We admit that those categories are limited and weak, and we say, I am not equipped to properly assess what matters and what's important in life. I need an outside perspective. And when we do that, we can start to preach the gospel to ourselves. And so how do we take this third person? Well, you can actually start talking in the third person. Here's a helpful exercise. You can take a session and write down your thoughts, but write them as if you were someone talking to you. As if you were someone else preaching the gospel to you in your situation, in your life. And if you have friends you can be vulnerable enough with, share your suffering with them and ask them to preach the gospel to you. You'd be surprised when you admit to people, I actually really suffer from feeling like I need to be liked by everyone all the time, feeling like nobody likes me, feeling like I'm always alone. And listen to how people will preach the gospel into that. Because when you stay inside that perspective and obsess over the social scoreboard, the way you will draw out the narrative will continue to fall into those categories that don't actually tell you what matters. They're false categories and they lie to you. So we have to take the third person. That's the first thing. The second thing that we can do that's helped by biblical wisdom is to come back to our bodies. Let me explain what I mean by this. Remember your childhood neighborhood for a second. Think about it, conceptualize it, close your eyes if you need to. Remember where all the neighborhood kids were, remember who you play with. Remember the houses that you would knock on the doors of and the houses you wouldn't. I mean, if we really try, you can remember all of those places where if you kicked your ball there, you could knock on the door and someone would get it for you, and the houses you definitely wouldn't do that with. The world was small back then. You could chart out where you could go and where you shouldn't go, and your social pool was tiny. You had maybe 5 or 6 people, and you could compare yourself to them. Well, he's better at football, but I have gifts in other areas. I can play music, and so I can learn from him, and he can learn from me. Well, he's taller, and I'm shorter, or she's prettier, but I have these and you start to realize that in that small world, even though comparison was still a trap, The pool wasn't large enough for you to really despair. It was just 8 or 9 people who lived nearby you. The world was small, but it's not like that anymore. You see, inside of your phone, you have the biggest neighborhood the world has ever offered. In fact, it's almost universal. You have access to every good neighbor and every bad neighbor. There's no longer just that one kid who is good at football. Now you have every kid who's good at everything. You don't just have that one neighbor who you wouldn't knock on their door if you hit your ball into their yard. You have every bad neighbor. You have the best and the worst that the world has to offer, and they're all at your doorstep, or more accurately, in your pocket. And so something strange begins to happen when you use the same tools you used as a kid to try to map where you are in the world and how you stack up. You enter into despair because now the pool is so large. It's hard to ask the question, who am I, in a crowd of 1 billion people? Because if you try to stake your value into any particular area, you realize that there are thousands upon thousands of people who do it better. And so you have 2 options in this scenario. You can either dive all the way into it and play the social scoreboard game and try to see how many followers you can rack up, how good at this thing you can be, how publicly you can succeed and how privately you can fail, and how great you can make your life seem so you can compete and play the game and compare. Or you can walk away from it. But walking away from it's tough. Because the deceptive thing about this big world is we're made to believe that this is really what matters. This is really where we're defined. But it's not the case. You see, when we do this, we begin to forget the basic facts of life. And here's something that's true about everybody. You're born, you live, and then you die. No matter how successful and popular you are, that's how it goes. And so let's start with the verse from Proverbs. This is Proverbs 17:1. It's very simple. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. The principle here is that you can go ahead and try to get everything, and even if you're successful at this social scoreboard game and you stack up well against this 1 billion people neighborhood, it won't be worth all the struggle you get to get there. And staying there is extremely exhausting. Much more preferable, then, is the humble life you might live in quiet. How do we do this? How do we detach ourselves from comparing ourselves to this huge, wide world of people and success and beauty and start to realize who we are and shrink our world back to the way it was when we were young and we could manage being in a group of people? I think it's a very simple thing. Here are some steps. Turn off your phone, leave it at home, go on a walk. There are a few things you're going to notice. First, you'll start to get thirsty. Maybe your legs will get tired. Maybe if you walk far enough, you'll wonder where you are. And all of a sudden, you'll realize that you are a person in a body who is very, very small. Your vision of your impact and what matters will shrink dramatically as the needs reduce from across the world and over the internet to your arm span. It's kind of a beautiful thing when you begin to struggle like this because you realize that you are a person again. You're not an online entity or a profile. You're a person. And people have needs. And then tomorrow you can do this again and you realize your world's beginning to shrink. And in any way possible, you can find ways to tire your body out, explore, feel like you're back inside of your body rather than an entity that needs to compare to everybody online. And all of a sudden, you'll come into contact with the basic facts of life again. Now, self-hatred can have many sources, and we're just looking at one, this whole social scoreboard idea. But it's important that with whatever realm of self-hatred we have, we begin to realize the basic facts of life and how small the things that we think matter so much actually are. The author of Ecclesiastes does this well. Throughout the entire book, he begins to show how fruitless successful lives are, how empty wisdom is, how pointless riches are, how vain short romances are. He brings us back to the basic facts of life and what truly matters inside that context. And it's important word. It's an important word for you to hear if you're struggling with self-hatred amidst the world of dating and comparison. Here's how he ends the book in chapter 12. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near of which you say, I have no pleasure in them. Remember your Creator. When everything else has been stripped away and you forget the social media profile and the Snapchat and the dating app and the relationship you regret from 5 years ago, whatever else it is, and how often you're playing on this social scoreboard, you'll come back to what actually matters when you start to live inside your body again and not inside this giant world of comparison. You'll stop focusing on how many likes you have, how many people you can attract, how many times you can reject people versus how many times you get rejected. Stop playing the game that leads you to self-hatred and start realizing that you are a person who God loves, who has needs, and you can actually start to meet them once you come back to your body. Now, I've just explored 2 solutions from biblical wisdom that could be practical ways you can start to ignore the social scoreboard and perhaps escape some of the self-hatred. I'm sure there are several more. It's been a joy to speak to you. Please leave your thoughts down in the comments, and I'll see you next time.